Support this podcast via our Patreon and get more writerly goodness. Visit patreon.com/nanocast to join up.
Welcome to NaNoWriMo Every Month. My name is J. Daniel Sawyer. I'm the author of some 20 books, 34 short stories, and numerous articles and other things, and I am your guide on this journey to use NaNoWriMo to level up to professional output levels. Today I want to deviate from my questions, partly because I'm looking to pad out the series so that I've got more days between recording blocks, and I'm running a little short on questions, and talk a little bit about observation. I've noticed a theme in a lot of the questions you guys are sending in, and the theme is observation. When it comes to teaching yourself things and learning things, it's amazing what you can pick up simply by being slightly more aware of the things you encounter every day. When you look around the world around you, there are incredibly complex and beautiful and intricate systems and chains of causality leading back from the surface layer that you're seeing around you. And they can be the source of great humor. I live right next to the ocean. And it's a bit of a mind-blower looking out at all that water and realizing the very simple fact that this vast ocean exists because all the water that falls everywhere just kind of ran downhill until it collected in one place and made a big puddle. Now that puddle is 70% of the surface of the Earth. But it's a big puddle. It works exactly the same as a puddle. It's there because it's the lowest point that the water could roll to. It's a very simple way to imply a vast chain of causality that involves evaporation and rain and rivers and stream networks and glaciers and gravity and all of that sort of stuff. Everything around you in the world is like that. Economies work on ecological principles. Ecologies work on economic principles. Things organize themselves everywhere. Languages come out of nowhere. Through common agreement, they self-organize. There is no, with the exception of the French, there is no great body that adjudicates what is proper English and what is improper English. There is no great body that adjudicates what's right or wrong in any given language. The rules of what's right or wrong arise through the usage and through the common agreement of individuals negotiating between themselves on the fly what something means. And then that agreement spreading through their neighbors until it becomes the dominant form of communicating in a population. And all of those things give rise to the set of rules of the language. Everything around you has that kind of a story behind it. There's a economics textbook, a very simple one called The Story of the Pencil, which explains how pencils are made and why no one person on the planet can actually make one. There's a lot of things around us that no single person can do, but that happen anyway because a bunch of different people do different things in a chain in the right way, and that makes the thing that you're talking about, whether it's a glass bottle or an aluminum can or a book or an old-style television screen or an LCD monitor or a vacuum cleaner. Everything around you is the end product, and end product is even begging the question a bit. Everything around you is an instantiation of a vast, complex network of worlds working together in dynamic and sometimes ever-changing ways to create all sorts of things, and that thing you're looking at is just one of them. And it's as true for cultural phenomenon as it is for technological artifacts. And I bring all of this up because a lot of it really is accessible to anyone who cares to look hard and ask the non-obvious questions. It's very easy when you're approaching a phenomenon to look at something you don't understand, and you realize you don't even understand it well enough to ask an intelligent question about it. So you look at the thing and you're like, I wish I understood more about that because it would make my writing so much easier. That's step one of the observation. You've noticed that there's something there to learn. Step 2 is getting your claws into it. Sending me questions is one of the ways to do that, and I'm not asking you not to send me questions. What I'm doing is I'm trying to give you a look into my process of how I get into all these things. Step 1 is asking the initial dumb questions. Step 2 is walking up to the thing a little closer and looking for the seams and starting to formulate more specific questions, because big general questions actually aren't very useful at the beginning. The big general questions are the questions you usually want to end with, because in order to answer them you need information that you don't have access to at the beginning. So, to pick on Sergeant Mike from yesterday's episode, rather than asking, for example, how do you make an alien language sound distinct when spoken in English? That's a conclusion question. That's laying out your goal way down the road. When you're approaching a topic that big, you want to find the small questions that give you access into that landscape between you and the destination. So you would ask something like, why is it that people who speak languages other than the one I speak natively talk the way they do? Why is it that I can tell from listening to them that they're not a native English speaker? That is a small question. That's a small question with very specific answers, and the very specific answers actually unlock the world for you and give you access to a vast landscape that will help you find the end point where you want to figure out how to do that with alien languages. This process of interrogation of the world around you is easier than ever it was before in world history, because we've got access to things like Wikipedia at the touch of our fingers, and informational resources that would have literally made many of the great wars of history unnecessary. We have access at our fingertips to more information than Bill Clinton did when he was President of the United States, even more information that would have been considered classified at the time. We can do all of that, but the thing that most of us don't learn in school, and I'm no exception, I did not learn this in school, is how to ask the questions that will make that information useful to us. Learning how to ask questions is probably the most important skill you can develop. Well, it's useful for a lot of things, but particularly as someone who's writing fiction, who's running their own business, and who's living a life of the mind that is essentially autodidactic, it's very important. The most important skill you can develop is the art of asking good questions. A good question is not a smart question. A good question is a question that will yield you a useful answer, especially one that will yield you not only an answer, but it will yield you new questions that you can then ask. Knowledge in any field is an ever-branching fractal. It's a root system full of possibilities. There's so much cool stuff out there, and it all relates to each other in some way or another. So there are many different ways to get any particular answer you're looking for. The trick to getting there, by whatever route you go, is to ask the right questions. So there's a few things that you want to look for to be able to have the right question. The first is you want a question that won't lead to a pat answer, which sounds counterintuitive, because when we ask a question because we want to know something. But there's a difference between asking a question that will yield a bit of knowledge and asking a question that will yield a lot of understanding. A question that will yield a bit of knowledge is, who played Captain Kirk in the original Star Trek? Well, the answer is William Shatner. Job done. That question's over. A question that will yield a understanding is, how was William Shatner cast in the role of Captain Kirk? That is a story that has embedded in it 1,000 different potential research paths, one of which will take you down the road of William Shatner's life history, another of which will take you deep into the studio politics at Paramount and the contentious relationship between Gene Roddenberry and Bob Justman. Another of which will take you deep into Gene Roddenberry's own past and to his military service record, and on and on and on. And this is a very trivial thing, right? Understanding these things probably won't help you understand the broader world in any direct way. But That makes it a useful example because no one's really got anything at stake with that question. So, principle 1 for asking a good question is ask questions that lead to understanding rather than to knowledge. They're not mutually exclusive, but understanding is knowledge plus the hooks that bit of knowledge has into other bits of knowledge. It's the relationship of that fact to other facts. Principle number 2 is to ask the simple questions. The big questions can't be answered by approaching them directly. They're kind of like wounded animals. If you've got a large, scary bit of stuff you need to get access to in order to accomplish something, or just because you're curious about it, approaching it directly is likely to wind up with you getting lost. Because there is so much, it's very hard to tell where to start. And frequently you can bumble around in any field for years sometimes and never really get the understanding you're looking for. Finding a path in, a small path like the hobbits going into Mordor, going in through a side road, is often much more effective at developing a true understanding of what's going on. And the reason for that is that the vast understanding is made up of two things. It's made up of understanding the smaller things that make up the vast thing. And it's made up of understanding how those things relate to each other. And how those things relate to each other on the ground in a real-world way is frequently different than the way they are presented in a formal educational hierarchy. For example, when you're looking at the history of science, if you study it in school, you get a very sort of linear progression of important dates and discoveries along the way. And you get the sense that scientists are these disinterested people who, and disinterested means someone with no personal stake. It doesn't mean uninterested. You get these disinterested people who are working for the betterment of mankind, who are trying to advance the cause of human knowledge and that sort of thing. And that leads us to the current day where suddenly everything's been corrupted by large corporations financing research to advance their own ends, and it's all going to hell. And the reason it's taught that way in school is partly historical. It has to do with something called the great man theory of history. But it's also partly because that's the way you can organize it well in a course of study and hit all the high notes. And if you want someone to have a very basic understanding of the history of science, you hit the high notes. But of course, that's not how the history of science works. The history of science has always been commercial. It's always been one of two things, actually. It's either been people trying to figure out how to make money by discovering something new that they can get a leg up over their fellows on, or it's been the product of people who are bored and autistic and fairly rich, trying to find something to do with themselves so they wouldn't embarrass the relatives. But whichever it was, in each case, the history of science is riddled with amazing feuds and fights and weird personal agendas that had nothing to do with what was going on. I mean, Isaac Newton considered his scientific inquiries to be a sideshow, very unimportant hobby, as opposed to his real investigations, which were into alchemy as a way to validate his theology, which was a very esoteric and weird Kabbalistic form of Christianity that involved the transmutation of metals and a Gnostic cosmogony and all that sort of stuff. And his science and his math were, they were important to him because that's where his day job was. But he did them basically to kill time and because he needed the money to fund his other experiments, which failed spectacularly. Understanding the history of science in this way leads you to a vastly different understanding of the entire enterprise of science in the modern world and how it works than the understanding of the history of science you get in a history classroom. And almost all fields of human knowledge are like that. The way that things are presented in school are presented in school for reasons that don't have a lot to do with understanding a subject well. They have to do with understanding a subject well enough, sometimes to tick the box of a standardized education requirement, sometimes because the people being taught don't need to understand a subject, they just need the facts, such as if you're teaching someone thermodynamic engineering, they really don't need to understand why Michael Faraday and John Gorey invented air conditioning, what they need to know is how the compression cycle works and what the current state of the art is so that they can go on and apply that knowledge in whatever engineering they're using. So that deep understanding is not important for people in all walks of life. But as a writer, the better you understand the things that feed into your writing, the more creative possibilities open up in front of you, and the easier time you have finding the information that you feel is missing when you're writing and you run up against a wall and you need to go do research. Anyway, I hope that's useful to you. I sense in many of your questions the frustration at how to get your fingers into a topic, and so I thought I would share a little bit of my method with you. Please keep sending in questions. You have no idea how much I love doing this and how good this is for my writerly soul and my discipline. It's wonderful. Please, please keep them coming. I'm getting close to running out, and I hope this special episode was useful for you guys, because this is what I love. This is the core of research, the understanding of things. So, with that said, I'll see you tomorrow. NaNoWriMo Every Month is written and presented by J. Daniel Sawyer and produced by Artistic Whispers Productions. Visit our website at nanowrimoeverymonth.com and leave a tip in the tip jar or join the Patreon to support this podcast. NaNoWriMo Every Month is copyright 2016 by J. Daniel Sawyer and Artistic Whispers Productions and is released under a Creative Commons Non-Commercial Attribution No Derivatives license.